care am ajuns atunci și pot să vă mărturisesc acum cu 2 zile înainte de predica o țineam în fiecare miercuri din săptămână.
Și ne-am întors încet. A fost foarte dureroasă întoarcerea noastră, n-a fost
Between my first period of imprisonment and the second period, there was no difference. The torture, the brutality was the same. For instance, in 1980, I was very sick in the hospital prison Jilava.
We are at the St. John the Baptist Cathedral, Washington, D.C., and I have a group of very honorable guests. And we are here today primarily honoring the memory of Father Gheorghe Calciu. And there is very little that has been known or even written about Father Gheorghe's journey in America. Most of us know Father Gheorghe primarily as the priest that went to prison in Romania, that was granted political asylum. But for some of us who actually have had the privilege of walking alongside these giants of faith, his influence has been way more impactful in terms of example of strength, resilience, faith, and above all joy, in which we have no Father for never have complained about anything. And some of the key people who actually even helped rescuing Father from prison are here today. And we are hoping that not only resources that will be attending the conference, but others that have been diligently documenting the lives of martyrs and confessors from prisons will not only learn about, but let others know and witness to the power of the giants, the contemporary giants of faith. So without further delay, let me start by asking our guests to introduce themselves. And let me start with Father Victor, who has actually blessed this event and helped us organize it. And from there we go. Please, Father Victor.
Well, my name is Father Victor Potapov. I'm the rector of the St. John the Baptist Russian Orthodox Cathedral in Washington, D.C. I've held this position, hard to believe, almost 40 years. I moved to Washington in 1977 from Stratford, Connecticut, where I had my first parish, to work at the radio station Voice of America, and also to help here at the parish. We had a very elderly priest who was here since early 1950s, Father Commander Nicholas Picatoros, Russian Greek, who served here for 27 years. And by the way, he was ordained to the priesthood during the persecutions of the church in Russia. In 1922, under Patriarch Tikhon, the holy confessor and first patriarch of the Russian church after 200 years. And he had connections to the catacomb bishops. He would act as a liaison between them, which was a very heroic act. So we were able to live and serve with a man who was ready to become a confessor himself, perhaps a martyr, Brother Nicholas. So after he left, I took over and I worked at the Voice of America, and which was a unique opportunity for me because I was in charge of religious broadcasting. And about the same time, we moved the headquarters of the Committee for the Defense of Persecuted Orthodox Christians in the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe here to Washington. I was the chairman of that committee for a long time. And among the activities of the committee was we published a quarterly journal called the Orthodox Monitor. which published essays, articles on the situation of Christians in Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union. What was the situation? It was persecution, torture, and in some cases death for Christ. And we tried to cover all of the Eastern European countries, not only Russia. And in my work as at the Voice of America, I had access to a lot of documents and news wires. I would see the news. It was never really given much airtime in the mass media. A lot of news comes on the ticker types and the wires and all that, but only that which interests the mainstream media is usually aired. But anyway, in that situation, I was able to first learn of the fate of Father Gheorghe, and his story made a deep impression upon me. His sermons that his homilies that he gave to the youth, especially the 7 words to the youth, I think it's called, and was amazing. And the way they were delivered and how the youth came and they closed the church, they closed the gates, and they climbed the gates to listen to him. And it was amazing, and he made a deep, deep impression on me. And then, of course, when his second arrest happened, not only did we publish materials about him in the journal, but I began broadcasting in my radio program, which was called Religion in Our Life. I broadcast Russian translations of some of his sermons. I gave updates on his situation. And a couple of times I was invited to speak before Congress, before a committee on human rights in the House of Representatives. And of course, I cited Father Gheorghe's fate, his situation, and I did my best to draw attention and to him and to his family, and ask the powers that be to intercede on his behalf. I hope that made an impression on them, and I hope it played a role. I'd like to think, and then we learned that one beautiful day, Father Gheorghe is in America, and he's here in Northern Virginia. My biggest regret is that I did not take advantage of his being in the local area. Unfortunately, we priests who live and serve in this area, we're serving at almost at the same time. There was very little interplay, unfortunately, among the parishes. But I remember vividly Father Gheorghe coming to our church for vigil services. I imagine they probably didn't have vigil services where he was serving at that time, or maybe just for some other reason. But I remember him standing. I would invite him to the altar. He said, "No, I'll stand with the people." He was very humble and thin, not large built, and there was an inner light that I noticed in him. You can sense that he was somebody you were drawn to. And I remember reading of the time when he was being tortured during his second arrest, I believe. And one of the prison guards came in, and Father Gheorghe thought that he was going to be tortured some more. And it was Easter time, Pascha. Father Gheorghe looked at him, the guard looked at him, and Father Gheorghe said, "Christ is risen." And the guard answered back, "Indeed, he is risen." And then Father George, I believe he was lying in his cot or something, and he was able to witness the uncreated light, which is amazing. I think this light touched him forever, and he shared it with people who came into contact with him. And of course, I was able to say bid farewell when he was the funeral service was being held at his church. But I think Father Leonid has a lot more interesting things to tell. He knew Father Gheorghe much more than I did personally. But I give thanks to God that I was in the position that I was at the Voice of America and the chairmanship of the Committee for the Persecuted Orthodox Christians. And we were able to, as best we could, to get the word out about this great man. People like Father Gheorghe have much to teach us. All the confessors have much to teach us. And I think the people of Romania and the people of Russia need to honor and respect and learn from these people, and never to forget what happens to a people who turn away from God. In that connection, I remember in 1983, I was in London, and I was there as a correspondent for the Voice of America to cover Solzhenitsyn's Templeton Prize speech. It's a magnificent speech. And I recall him saying that he had studied the Russian Revolution and the philosophical and intellectual trends of the Russian intelligentsia in the 19th and 20th centuries before the revolution. And he always tried to understand why it was that the revolution happened. He couldn't find a real reason. He could find many reasons, but the main reason. And he said finally he came to the conclusion that his grandfather came to. He says, grandson, the reason this all happened is because people forgot God. They turned away from God. Mm-hmm. And Solzhenitsyn says, here I am, one of the most knowledgeable people concerning the revolution, and this is the conclusion that I can come, only conclusion I can come to as well. That people have forgotten God, and this is the reason for all of it. So, living saints or people like Father Gheorghe, who was our contemporary, not someone who lived in the 4th century, 5th century, which sometimes is hard to imagine. But this is in our lifetime. People suffered for Christ like he did. It's so inspiring. And I think that there are so many books on Father Gheorghe in English and in of course, Romanian and in Russian, and it's out there. And I think it makes for very good spiritual reading. So I want to say thank you to the organizers of this meeting here in Washington, and also the folks that have gathered in Brussels. And God bless you all.
Amen, Father Victor. And actually, piggybacking on the comment that you have just made in terms of respecting and learning about the word of these contemporary confessors. When it comes to mind when Father Gheorghe actually stated that how you lose your connection with God comes in very subtle ways. It doesn't come all of a sudden. He said, and he looked at me, he said, do you think that the communism came to Romania overnight? No. It's like you watch, first you take God out of schools. Then, it's like in very small steps, and the analogy that he used at that time it's just like that crack in the windshield. Just a very annoying pebble. And before you know, the entire structure is shredded. and it's compromised.
Right.
Yeah, and we have, and just like yourself, you mentioned, I am just as guilty. We had so much light, because after all of the suffering, if you actually look at his pictures and his smile, there was this inner joy, and that is unexplainable. I mean, he found, in fact, when he was dying, we actually got to spend a lot of time together in the hospital through the night, and he was praying, and he looks and said, I miss my times in prison. And I looked at him and said, how can you say such a thing, Father? And he said, Maria, even now, I know that I'm dying, but I could never pray and connect to God like I did then. Because I had nothing. I had nobody, no hope other than God. And so you see that in prison, many can find bitterness, and self-righteousness. How could they have done that? In fact, it was the only time I've experienced it, seeing Father Georg not angry, but upset. It was, we went to visit a monastery, and one of his colleagues that he respects a lot, but he made a comment, well, this country owes us because we went to prison. We were sacrificed for them. And Father Georg said, how could you say that, such and such? All of the sacrifice, you know what you just did. Everything that you went through, you just threw in the garbage. It was worthy nothing. If God allowed us to walk through that, it's because he wanted us to learn something from it and to give back what we had learned. So that humble spirit, and you saw Father Victor, even when Father came to St. John, he used to really enjoy, he told me that, the services in here. I said, why, Father? Because it's very traditional. He was all about tradition. And he fought for a long time to keep the services, even in the US, in the native language, just to keep the tradition. And he used to sit all the way in the back. I remember one of the comments that you made was, I had this saint in my church, and he used to sit all the way in the back. But that's how I got to know Father George in America. Even when we went to Wagner events, he would sit all the way in the back and waited until he was invited. And he was perfectly content in being in this humble area. So that to me was quite striking. And I am also guilty of not have taken advantage when I did have the choice of not spending more time with him and learning more from him. In fact, the 2 weeks that I spent with him at the hospital, and I'm happy I made that choice, even though work-wise it may not come across very right, because it was extremely impactful here. But anyhow, let me push the spotlight where the spotlight should be today. Thank you very much, Father Victor. Thanks for everything, and we hope that one day we're going to be able to pray his Akatas. Without further delays, let's pass on to Father Leonid.
Well, I'm Deacon Leonid Mickle. I'm just this guy. I've been serving as a deacon in Father Victor's Cathedral of St. John the Baptist since 1982. And it's a little awkward for me to talk about Father Georgi because when I became acquainted with him, I was spiritually an infant. Like so many people in the second wave emigre community, it was a given that one was Orthodox. But what did that mean? That did not mean being a regular churchgoer. It was a tradition, it was a culture, it was all sorts of things except the main thing. In the 1970s, I started questioning where I was going, and that coincided with Father Gheorghe's, with the publication of Father Gheorghe's 7 Words for Orthodox Youth in an American publication, The Orthodox Word. And it was like a lightning bolt when he said, "Christ is calling you." And I could say, annoyed to hear that. And all of the questions he was posing to youth, although I was already an adult, were very pertinent. You start making choices. You start thinking about where your life is. And I know this talk isn't supposed to be about me, it's about Father Gheorghe, but he is one of the reasons that I angrily came up the steps of St. John's to settle once and for all what was missing from my life. And to my surprise, it was a lot more than I had thought. Later, I became personally acquainted with him, first through the committee to which Father Victor referred, through reading the Orthodox Monitor, through hearing the testimonies of various dissident clergy who came to visit. And then, to my surprise, I discovered that Father Gheorghe not only was in the United States, but he'd been assigned to a church across the street from my office building. I had a secular job. I was a government bureaucrat. And my window faced Holy Cross Church. And it became my practice that if the doors were open, he was generally puttering in the garden in front of the church, I would take a couple of hours of personal leave and go over and talk. I had heard so much about him being a giant in resistance to the atheist authorities. It simply did not comport with the image that he projected, which was radiant joy. I, of course, had been making up for all the years that I had ignored what was going on in the church. And I repeatedly asked him to tell me about conditions in the camp. At that point, I had not read his accounts of life in the prisons. And he never would answer me. And again, I became annoyed and said, "Well, Father, at least what gave you the strength to endure the horrible things about which I've read that were done to you on a daily basis?" And he fixed me with a very stern gaze and said, "I'm a priest. That's all you need to know. I behaved as a priest must. The day will come, all of you in the United States will be called to behave in that same way. The only thing that will give you strength is faith in God, who is the source of all strength." And then he was back to happy, smiling, joking mode. Again, I was balancing service to the church and a career, and I did not take full advantage of his being accessible. And I only got to know him a bit more later, after he had been diagnosed with the cancer, which ultimately took him. When he left for his homeland to say goodbye to some of his spiritual children, I learned that a group of parishioners at Holy Cross were coming together on a weekly basis, may have been more often, I can't remember, to pray. And I began taking part. We did Akafist hymns to St. George, St. Panteleimon, to Our Lady, and it was an opportunity to share in the love that his flock felt for him. It was extremely moving. At that time, I was a little bit concerned that people were asking whether this could bring him healing, physical healing. And I thought of something he quoted to me, and I later saw in a video of Elder Cleopo. It was asked, what is the most important thing you should think of as you are structuring your life? And he said, morta, 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 morta. To live with the recognition that you're going to die, but to maintain that joy in the fact that you live here on earth in God's love, and that you are called to cultivate that quiet light in your own life, that fosilaros, in which I never saw disappear from his countenance. When he returned, he went from Dulles Airport to Fairfax Hospital, and there was continuous prayer for the next 3 days. And struck me as very interesting that over the course of all of that time, the nurses recognized who they were dealing with. 8 o'clock visiting hours are over. They drive everybody out of the room. There'd be 15, 25 people at any given time, although 2 visitors are the maximum that's allowed. And they would go off into the hall, and then the nurses would go back to the nursing station and we would return. And as encouragement to leave, and you can verify this, about 10 o'clock they turned out the lights. But people continued to read and pray because the light was there. When he reposed, instantly someone took a large candle, placed it in his hands, and lit it. When the nurses came in to begin stripping the bed and all of that, no one put out the candle.
That's the candle.
No one said, there's oxygen flowing here, there are warnings. There was never any question. They saw that a righteous person who prayed, who lived in the light of Christ, had reposed. How did he affect me? Through that joy, through that happiness that he manifested, no matter what the situation. This seems to be, at least in my limited contact with people who have gone through the camps, have gone through the prisons, is a common typical characteristic. They're happy to be here because they are happy to be living with being fully conscious that this is only temporary and that they are moving toward our common goal. How does he affect others? Well, I know that he has affected thousands, if not millions, with those 7 words for Orthodox youth. Someone who is as old as I am could reread them and gain even more than initially gained. But simply by his example, I never heard him condemn any one of his torturers. I read, Julia, in one of your articles that he turned everything that he had experienced into love and compassion for those who were torturing him. We're called to love one another. This is how Christ will know that we are his children. And by his example, not even necessarily by his words, but simply by his example, he affected everyone that he encountered. I once described him to someone who was Russian-speaking as Svetloya Lichnost, a bright or glowing personality. And she said, "You saw it too?" Mm. But you look at people, you can see that inner light, whether it's visible externally or not. They live in that light. And I thank God that I have the joy of meeting him, if only very, very briefly.
Thank you very much. And there are a couple of interesting coincidences, if I may, Father Leonid. Even at the time in which Father was, about to give his soul, I was very overwhelmed. His wife, Matushka Adriana, my baptism godmother, her glucose was very high because of distress. And Father had given me specific instructions of what to read when he was passing away. I had to lit up the candle, and there were so many logistics that I had to work out. And I said, how am I going to do all of this? And out of nowhere, right, like coincidences, arranged coincidence, there comes Father Leonid. Maria, I was just taking a lunch break and I thought that I should stop by. And I said, Father Leonid, oh, thank God. And I said, I need for you to please read the prayers. And it was right at the time. So I think it was one of Father George's gift to you, Father. And Father Leonid comes to the foot of the bed and starts reading the prayer, while I had somebody else also with 2 spare lights, because when I lit up the light, we actually brought them to church. And so it was just the help that I needed, but the timing was unbelievable. He arrived in there literally less than 5 minutes before.
Well, I was not intending to be there that day. I had a medical appointment, and I worked in the morning. And I had, the night before, I had not said goodbye. Simple as that. And I was told that his repose was imminent, but I went to work, and then I was, just in case, lunch hour, I'll stop by. And that was when he was within minutes of repose.
Yeah, and it was the first person that I saw in the whole way.
The thing that really struck me was that he was perfectly lucid throughout that time. Mm-hmm. And if one could say that we strive after dispassion, you could see that he had attained complete dispassion. There was no emotional demonstration. If people came to him already grieving, he quickly calmed them. He's someone I feel very blessed to have known.
Yeah, and the second example, as it relates to the parishioners at the Holy Cross, it was a very difficult time to all of the parishioners because there was no other priest, and everybody was in a lot of distress. And when I reached out to Father Leonid, I said, we don't even know what to pray. And, we are coming to church and sort of gathered a group of people, let's come to church. And we were just sort of looked into occultists and, St. Pantaleon, and Father Leonid actually graciously not only came every night, but he also brought an icon from here of St. George that had a relic of St. George, and the comfort that this brought to the community was incredible. They were looking forward to that time to be there praying. And the people that were coming to the hospital, we had to actually call the police. And that is actually a very important event, because I was actually angry as a sinner that I am, because I said, Father, I am going to send all of these people home. Where were they when you were cleaning the church? Because he did everything, vacuuming the church, making candles. I have beautiful pictures of, him. He has a wonderful sense of humor. I said, where were all these people when you were, driving food to the poor? He had this arrangement with the grocery stores, boxes and boxes, he lifting them up. Even as he was terminal, he was doing that. I said, where were all these people? Now, this is so selfish. You need your peace to die. This is an oncological center. This is very disrespectful. I'm going to send everybody home. And he looked at me and he said, no, Maria, let them come one by one. And he did not die until he blessed every single person who came through the door. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because and the lesson to me at that time, he said, but I had never even seen these people at church, and he said, but to Christ, remember Christ dying on the cross, the thief right next to him, even the last minute, even the people who show up at the last minute, that is hope. And you let them in.
We hear that apostolate every year.
Exactly. And I witnessed
the first hour, the 9th hour, or even at the 11th hour.
Exactly. And he witnessed that to me in the hospital. So it's incredible testimony. Thank you so much, Father Leonid, for sharing it. There is a lot more, I'm certain, but for the sake of time, this is only part 1, right? Hopefully there will be many more that we can gather more details. Let's go around. We are going in this logic. Marilyn, please.
Well, I have not had anywhere near the experiences you all have. I was a member of the Committee for the Defense of Persecuted Orthodox Christians. Soon after we moved to Washington with my husband and children, I was not yet Orthodox. I simply loved Russia. And I was invited to join this committee by Vladimir Tolstoy at a dinner party in Washington. Oh, yes, he said, you must come and join us. I said, yes, I would love to. And of course, it really was absolutely fascinating, because of the cases that came up and what we were doing and all the things besides prayer for these persecuted prisoners and their families. And of course, I think probably the most dramatic case, the one that really hit me most of all, was Father Georghecalciu. It was incredible, reading all that he did. Actually, my membership in this committee brought me into Orthodoxy. Now, all of that started some 20 years before. I will just relate this because it's the providence of God. Absolutely. As a young college student, I spent 3 months one summer with friends and a group of Americans in Europe, and 3 weeks in the Soviet Union. And when we were in Moscow, one of my friends who was Catholic, and I visited a Catholic priest in Moscow who was serving the diplomatic colony. And he told us there was one place we absolutely had to go to, and it was a Lavra, the Trinity St. Sergius Lavra. And he said, I would take you if I could, but my schedule does not allow. So I decided at my young age, well, we will go. I will do it. So I gathered 3 others, and I was the only one in the group who spoke any Russian. I had only 1 year of it. But we, Father Dion, I still remember him, told us how to get to the train station to take the electrichka to get out to Zagorsk. He said, you have to go to Zagorsk. This is a must. And so all that he said, I thought we really do have to go there. And it's a long story how we got there. It was miraculous. And only years later did I understand that, fortunately, the one person standing on the platform when we finally got off the train, of course, was a young, very attractive young Army officer, Soviet Army officer. He smiled at us, and he, thank God he never asked us for papers, because we had no visa to be at Zagorsk. If he had, he would have been in a lot of trouble. We were only to be in Moscow. I simply asked him how to get to the monastery. I only understood half of what he said, but we had it off, and we got to the monastery. It was right after the feast of St. Sergius. It must have been July.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the 19th or 20th, something like that. There were still pilgrims walking around. And of course, walking there was absolutely fascinating. It was like walking through a page out of Turgenev, because the streets were not paved. There were horse-drawn milk carts going by. It was absolutely incredible. And so at one point, I got as far as I could with the directions I understood, and then asked a young student along the way, "Oh, I will take you," he said, and he brought us up to the doors of the monastery, and I said, "Can you join us?" "No, I cannot." I understood, of course, if you wanted a career of any kind, you could not join us. But we walked in, looked around, and saw these pilgrims walking around in all these different churches. And so one of the students in the group who was with us, who was actually a seminarian, Union Theological Seminary in New York, a young man, said, "Let's go into the oldest church." And I said, "Oh, that's a very good idea." So we looked around and we found what actually was the oldest church, the stone church of the Trinity. And we walked, I remember walking into that church all those many years ago as if it was yesterday, because we stepped into another world. Absolutely another world. It was incredible. It was an atmosphere I could not explain, I could not understand. I knew I had never experienced anything like this before. Peace, warmth, love. What was it? Of course, it was the atmosphere of holiness, as I understood later. And of course, the relics of St. Sergius were there. I'd never heard of St. Sergius. I had no idea who he was. I had no idea he was there. But there was this atmosphere that was incredible. And there was the only other person in the church was a priest who was chanting, probably the occultist, of course, but chanting something. The whole atmosphere was just incredible. We stood there for a long time. And he turned to me, the student who was with me, he said, "This is very moving, isn't it?" I said, "Yes, it is." Before we left, I had a thought that as I look back on it all these years, I believe it was a prayer that was heard by St. Sergius and blessed. I'll explain why in a minute. The thought was, if I'm ever in a position to help believers in Russia, I will become Orthodox. That was the thought. And of course, 20 years later, that's exactly what happened. Right there. When I became a member of the Committee for the Defense of Persecuted Orthodox Christians, and then slowly was moving closer into Orthodoxy. And of course, it was when Vladimir Tolstoy asked me to be the godmother of the child they were adopting. I said, "But Vladimir, I'm not Orthodox." "Oh, this is the time to become Orthodox." And it struck a chord. Yes, that's exactly right. And then, of course, I asked Masha to be my godmother. She was the only Orthodox woman I really knew. So I was received in 1981 by Bishop Basil Rodzianko, who had also spent some years in prison. And very interesting to hear what you said about Father Georgi, recalling so many years later, but I was so happy in prison. I was the happiest. Bishop Basil said exactly the same thing. Becoming Orthodox was as I felt at the time, beginning the second and even happier part of my life, which is that. So I was already a new Orthodox when Father Georgi was finally released from prison and came to Washington. And there were a few of us. Bishop Basil, you were with us, I think, Father Victor, when we went to the little church in Arlington, Holy Cross, to see him for the first time soon after he arrived. And I was absolutely stunned by looking at him. He looked like one of those early pictures we saw here. Warm, smiling, radiant, full of joy. I thought, how incredible, after all those years, how can he possibly have this? But of course, it was his inner life, as you all described so well, this joy. I had very little opportunity, unfortunately, for whatever reasons, to see him more than just a few other times. And of course, I never had a chance to get to know him as you all did. But that image, I still see it as I think about this and describe it. I still see that image of him, just radiant with joy. That is lasting. And I think, it's these, all of this, what we're describing today, just reminds me of one of the great themes of, I came to know Bishop Basil, of course, very well after he received me, but one of his great themes in his sermons, in his programs, his religious programs, in his life, was the providence of God. He used to say, the will of God is always for good. The providence of God brings good out of evil. And that's what we see, great good that has come out of these people who have suffered so terribly, not only in their own life, people like Father Georgi and Bishop Basil too, but what their effect on the people around them, on the environment around them. And it is an ongoing, living legacy, all of this. So thanks be to God, because we have no idea what is coming next in our country.
Amen. In the world.
Amen. Exactly.
Amen.
Exactly.
Amen. And I'm happy actually to Marilyn that you shared a little bit about Bishop Basil. Very similar paths, different trajectories, but very similar outcomes. And in terms of the joy that comes, the focus that we typically see, even in the Passion of Christ, you see a lot of the Mel Brooks movie, right? A lot of the focus in the beatings and the scarring and things like this. But if you look even how the Gospels were written, very the emphasis is, and then he was crucified. Right? Because the emphasis is we look not that we are undermining the suffering that takes place in prison, but like with the Apostle Paul, Bishop Basil, Father Georgi, what was the effect of passing through Golgotha on earth? Right? What was the outcome is really unveiling a godly instrument that has touched so many of us in so many different ways, and is that impression that is everlasting. And you didn't have to spend too much time with him either. It was just like this magnet you were drawn into. And we are very, very fortunate to have had walked among these confessors. That sparkle that many of you are talking about, that light, I see represented in people who were touched by him, even though they perhaps cannot see it in themselves yet, per se. But, that sparkle sort of, it passes along. In terms of the other point that you brought up that is excellent to Marilyn, is the contentment and the joy. Not too many people know. I know that from Nasha Adriana, Father's wife. When Father was terminal, he would wake up in the middle of the night. She used to have a lot of cramps, diabetes, and and she was not very good with her diet. Father was much better, maintenance-wise, but terminal, he would wake up in the middle of the night to massage her legs. Terminal, he would still make his prostrations. I have his list that he kept at home of all of the names. And that was the first thing that he did every morning when he got up. So his priority, and in fact, one of the things that I should have said even from the very beginning is really paying a tribute to Nasha Diana too. We speak a lot about Father Gheorghe. Nasha Diana has been a source of strength to him. She faithfully waited for him when he went to prison for 22 years. She had her house, her dignity stripped. Even the priest, there is a priest in New York that came to visit her, were taken to prison just because he came to visit her and her son. I have the inventory of everything that was taken. Her house was left bare. And there were games that were played. They would go and tell Father that she had left him and remarried, and tell her the same thing. He doesn't want to come back to the family at all, or he's dead. She, not for a second, she wavered. And not only that, she was a very prominent biologist in Romania that I actually visited, and you're not going to believe that, Father Terminal. And Andrea Gabriel and myself, we go, Nasha Diana asked him, you're going to go for your last visit to Romania? Please go and bless the Institute of Health where I used to work. This huge building. And he and his father walking the whole building, and we were holding the jar of water. And Andrea and I could barely let and Father, just terminal of pancreatic cancer. It's just incredible stories like this. I could not keep up. Andrea could not keep up. He was complaining, but this energy, and his last service here in the U.S. was an Easter service. He took confessions until the service started, Romanian time, which is close to midnight. But he basically stood up for 18 hours, and I had morphine. He did not want anybody besides Andrea and myself to know that he had pancreatic cancer to the very end. And he stood up on his feet for almost 18 hours. And I said, Father, do you need, just a little bit of morphine? He said, no, it's going to mess up my head. I'm fine. And I was standing up on top of the church, all the way up top, and everybody completely unaware, the streets closed with people, and he completely normal, and I'm like, where does he find this strength? So going back to Father Leonid, he told me the same thing. He said, Father, how? I don't understand. It's not human. Even the doctors told me the same thing. For the way that his blood count was, any normal human being would have died, days before. And he stood in there. But he told me the same thing. He said, do you think, don't look at me, because that's not for me. So if I rely on my own strength, I said, Maria, if you rely on your own strength, there is very little that you can accomplish at all. Strength is from above. Not that we are deserving of it, but the more you rely and you understand that if you really only put your trust in reliance on your own strength, that's when you start breaking. And I make this mistake many times, that we get overwhelmed, right? Because we have focused too much inwards instead of, hey, I know I can't do that, but, in God I can do all things. So he understood that concept very well. Thank you very much, Marilyn, and also for sharing about Bishop Basil. Hopefully we're going to have also many books coming. There are many tapes, right? Video tapes.
Oh,
that only now are going back to Russia.
About half of them are there now.
And impacting people.
Oh, yes.
Right? And he's
very well known.
Yeah.
And of course, his broadcasts played a large role in the reemergence of Orthodox Christianity in Russia.
But isn't this amazing? Russia, that has been known, in the past, was known in the past for being the atheist. You see the reversal, the complete reversal of this revival and the richness that is happening. It's for us it's scary in terms of what we are facing now, but we keep on praying. We keep on praying. Thank you so much, Marilyn. Thank you, and without further delay, let's go to Matushka Frederica.
Yes, my name is Frederica Mathewes-Green, and I am Matushka, Priotessa, right? Yeah,
Priotessa.
Presbytera, and my dear husband here, as well as Father Gregory. And we are converts to Orthodoxy and became Orthodox in 1993 and founded a little church about 45 minutes drive from Father George's church, also called Holy Cross. So we've been Orthodox now, getting closer to 23 years. And when I think about Father George and when I hear the stories that the rest of you can tell, you've been Orthodox so long and you're able to know him for such a long time. And I didn't. I think of myself growing up, a little girl in South Carolina, and thinking that all the Soviet Union countries, they were godless communists. I thought there was no faith, that they were all atheists. And wasn't it wonderful to be American because we were Christians? And while I was, drinking my chocolate milk and watching Wide World of Disney on TV, so many were suffering. So many men and women were dying for their faith. And I didn't know it. I thought I was a Christian and that those nations were not. And I had a lot of learning to do. I spent my teenage years totally away from Christ. I had a rather dramatic conversion back to Christian faith when I encountered the presence of Jesus Christ and knew that he was resurrected, that he had risen from the dead because he was talking to me. If he was alive right then and speaking inside the little radio in my heart, I didn't know what it was. This radio turned on and he spoke to me. I knew that he really is the Lord. And so my husband and I, who had his own cinema, he was also an atheist. I was a kind of hippie, feminist, Mother Earth, agnostic, but seeker. I read a Hindu prayer at our wedding. And my husband had been like a political atheist. He was not a spiritual seeker like I was. I don't want to take too much time with that, but it was like we were race cars, one's ahead, the other's ahead. The Lord was pulling us toward himself, inch by inch, step by step, and we ended up crossing the finish line at the same time. Coming in 1974 to be very committed evangelical Protestant Christians and not really knowing. We didn't know anything of Orthodoxy. In our little town, Charleston, South Carolina, there was one church. It was a Greek Orthodox church. You had to be Greek to go there. It never would have occurred to anybody to try to join the Greek Orthodox Church. So we were contented evangelical Protestants for 15, 20 years. He was an Episcopal priest, an Anglican priest for 15 years. And we began to see that church was getting unstable and that the bishops in leadership were teaching that Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that he wasn't born of a virgin, that he didn't do any miracles. And as we had children then who were about to come into their teens, we thought, we have to get out of this church, because even though he was a pastor, he controlled the preaching and the teaching inside the walls of that church. But what happens when our kids grow up, get married, and move away? And they go to the Episcopal church down the street, and the preacher is preaching things that are not Christian. So we looked around, and we ended up, another long story I'll shorten, but we ended up becoming Orthodox. The first time he went to an Orthodox Vesper service, he fell in love with it. The next week, he brought me back, you've got to come to this Vesper service. I didn't like it at all. I didn't get it. I didn't like the singing. I thought everybody's just standing there. They're not worshiping. If you're evangelical, you're worshiping, and everything's in motion and you're moving and it's all, emotional. And I thought, well, these Orthodox people, they just stand there looking serious. They're not really praying. That was how I judged them. It took me a little longer than it took my husband to fall in love with the Orthodox Church. once we were chrismated, I realized that it was what I'd been looking for all my life as a Christian, that I had always sought to be able to draw near to the Lord the way he drew near to me on that day, June 20th, 1974, when he spoke to me. And I came to gradually realize that that is really all that Orthodoxy is about. The whole church is about cultivating your ability to draw near to the Lord, to make room for him, to shed the sins that hold us back, to learn how to pray, to learn how to be one with him. And really that's all that Orthodoxy is. Everything we do, say, teach, it's all about facilitating that transformation in Christ. So I fell very much in love with Orthodoxy. So by this point, I've been Orthodox 5 years, 6 years, and I don't really have a spiritual father. Can't be my husband, obviously. And I was looking around. We'd gone to confession to several different priests that were in the area. So I just started sending out word, do you know anybody? Do you know anybody? And it was actually Bishop Basil Essie, the Antiochian bishop in Wichita, Kansas, who said, well, Father George Calciu lives right by you. Why don't you go see him? And I had already read the book. I had read Christ is Calling You. I had immense admiration for Father George. I thought he was still in Romania. I had no idea that he'd come to America, and much less that he was just 45 minutes away from my front door at another church called Holy Cross. So I phoned. I think I went through several times where Mariska would answer the phone and she knew not English, and I'd be like, hello, hello. She'd be talking in Romanian, I don't know. So I had to keep trying to call until finally Father George answered once. This is long before the email or the internet. And I was able to make an appointment to see him. And I'll never forget the first time I went. It was a rainy day. And those who haven't seen this church, it's an unusual setting because the church itself is a very simple white wooden church built about 1900 or 1910. And it is totally surrounded with built-up American suburbs by, as Father Leonid was saying, these immense skyscrapers across the street that are full of office buildings and a shopping mall and great big restaurants. And in the middle, this little humble church that for some reason they never sold year after year, when I'm sure people kept saying, I'll pay you more money, more money. This is a very priceless piece of real estate. It stayed a church all that time. So I remember driving and pulling up beside this little tiny anomalous church and going in, and one thing that I learned is that the Romanian sense of what it means to have an appointment was not exactly the American sense of, we said we'd meet at 3 o'clock, it's 3:45, now it's 4 o'clock. And what had happened was another lady had come to also ask him about being her spiritual father, but she was angry and she was demanding, and he was so sweet to her. And their conversation went on as I walked around this church. It was raining, it smelled wonderful. I could hear the big trucks, all the traffic going by outside. I remember wandering over to one back corner, and there were all these little handmade looking candles. It looked like somebody had taken candles, like just the ends, and melted them down, and then poured them into little glass vigil cups. And I wondered if it was Father George that did that.
Yes, in
Yes,
fact,
it
some
was.
of the pictures that you might see playing in the background.
Yes.
Yes, he did that in the evening, and I used to come from work, and just as an excuse to help him make candles, just to talk to him.
Oh, I wish I had one of those candles today.
He was the one, he was the one making them, and always
He
with
did
the
everything. He did everything. As
He did.
Father Leonid said, he was, he'd be watering the flowers and raking and clipping. Everything that was done in that building.
He
did
loved
it
his
all.
flowers. When we were driving to chemotherapy, he used to make me stop the car when he saw, Marilyn, look at this flower. He loved life. He loved,
He really did.
he saw God in everything.
He was so generous, and the cheerfulness, as everyone else says, that I don't know what I expected to see. But I knew the suffering he'd gone through, and when I met him and I saw that smile and the the light behind his eyes. And he would come over when I went to see him. He said, come every 40 days for confession. Every time I went, he would greet me and he would come up and he'd stand beside me and hold my hand and he would smile and I would smile and I would think, now the angels are rejoicing and the demons are cursing. You know, we destroy the demons just by smiling after all he's been through, and I can join into that smile. Much, much later, after he told me he was the youngest of 11 children and his mother's favorite and always the baby of the family, it occurred to me that that smile that he had was actually the reflection of his mother's smile. That the smile that he learned, the smile that came to him after he'd suffered so much, was a reflection of the utter security and love he felt in his cradle. And looking into his mother's face, that was the face that had been reflected in his eyes as he gazed at her. And it was her smile that he was carrying forward into the future and that had borne him up through so much. I often think it was like his experience in the prisons was like if you're driving down a road and you hit a T crossing, as we say in America, T, you can't go forward, you have to go either left or right. And everyone who went into those prisons faced that T crossing, where they had to decide whether they would cooperate and be sickened and be decayed and destroyed by letting that evil into them, or whether they would turn toward the light and turn toward the right and turn toward God and abandon all strength in themselves and take all their strength from the Lord. It was, as you look back at the way he talks about his first imprisonment, and he was a young man, was it 22 or something?
Yeah.
And I think my impression is not as devout then as he became later on. He was planning to be a doctor, was not planning to be a priest at that time. And he was brilliant, he was always brilliant.
Yes.
And I think that in the prison, he faced something where his brilliance was not going to be enough to pull him through. That his native abilities and talents and everything that just made him an exemplary and unusual human being, that was not going to be enough. And he talked about how he would be tortured to the point that he actually would deny his faith. He said, you're out of your mind with pain. You don't even know what you're saying. And he wasn't able to resist the torture. But he said, I did deny the Lord, but when I was alone again at night and I could pray and I could weep and repent and ask the Lord's forgiveness for my denial, that was very sweet. And I think only of us who had occasion to repent know how that can be sweet instead of miserable, how that was sweet to him. And I think he got a taste for that sweetness. He got a sweet tooth like Modeshka had.
Oh, he did.
He got a sweet tooth for the presence of the Lord.
Absolutely, and the grapes that he loved, because it reminded him, he actually liked, even outside of Holy Cross, there is still a vine that was planted not by him, by Matushka. Not many people know about that, but it was the joy of his life, just going there, because it reminded him, he really enjoyed the concept of abiding. It's a very strong,
abiding in the vine.
The meaning of abiding and where you draw your strength from, and how you renew yourself from abiding.
He certainly knew how to do that.
Yeah, he did.
And I think it was a lesson he had to learn in the emergency catastrophe conditions of the prison, that he had to stop relying on himself as a very clever young man and start realizing how empty he was on his own. I remember he says in Christ is Calling You that the torture went through several stages, but he said it was the last stage that was most devastating when they were compelled to torture other people, other prisoners. Yeah. And that is what destroys your sense of humanity.
Yeah, exactly.
It is something that is so out of sync with what you believe yourself to be. He said that is the point at which most of us try to kill ourselves. And so I think we shouldn't we shouldn't pretend that Father George was anything other than an ordinary, extremely gifted and intelligent person at first. Otherwise, we can't imagine ourselves walking in his footsteps. That we can see that at the very beginning, he had a choice of relying on the brilliant man he was, or of abandoning all that, falling in repentance, and accepting only the power of God. And he made the only choice that leads to life. And we are able to do that. We should take courage from the transformation he was able to accomplish and then maintain to the age of 81, that he was able to maintain all his life, that shone out of him like a light, all his life. That it's not just like a museum exhibit that we admire, that God calls us to that as well. You know, that's why the book is titled, Christ is Calling You. Christ is calling us. Even as old and worn out as we are, Christ continues to call us. And he gave us the example. I'm trying not to cry. He gave us the example of what it looks like when he, George Calciu, Father George, is transformed. And he says, you know, now think about for you, what will God do in you when he transforms you this way? And I guess that's the last thing I wanted to sum up with, because we've talked a couple of times about, it's come up about what if America faces that kind of persecution someday. And people laugh at us for even thinking about it, but to know that it has happened, that it happened in the last century, it can happen again. He told that story pretty frequently about it being Pascha. He knew that it was Pascha because he heard the bells ringing. And he determined that when they came in for the daily count, and they can stand, say his number, say his name, that he wasn't going to do that. And they opened the door and he said, Christ is risen. And he said there was a pause, and the soldier, the guard, almost not under his own control, said, indeed, he's risen. And then they went away, and he said, it was at that point, he said, he began to see everything glow. He saw the uncreated light, that the light was everywhere. And I know that I got so much less out of knowing him than other people did, because I couldn't understand what he was saying so much of the time, because his English wasn't perfect. And my Romanian is non-existent. So I admire the amount of English he had. But I always remember he said, the board was full of shine. The board that he slept on, the board was full of shine. But that's only the first half of this story, because he began to think about, now they will send the head of the guards, and it's going to be tough. And the head of the guards is going to come and interrogate me about what I said. And I'm going to have answers. I need to think about what I'll say. And he said it became almost like he was watching a movie in his mind, that the guard would have his lines to speak, and that Father would have his lines to speak that would be devastating and clever, and, you know, just this man is going to be so perplexed and he won't know what to say. And so the guard came and he opened the door, and it was exactly like he'd imagined. He said, you know, what do you mean? Have you ever seen him? How do you know he rose from the dead? Well, I have not seen him, but I don't need to see him because... And he said, that's when the light began to fade. That's when the light began to fade. He began to lose the vision of the uncreated light, because he was acting in a drama in which he was one of the stars. And he was using his extreme brilliance, his extreme intelligence, and his eloquence to do battle. Right, we know that we're supposed to do battle. We're supposed to bear witness, right? But that was where the light began to fade. And he said, I wish I had his exact words, but he said, those sorts of arguments don't persuade people. They don't convert. The only thing that converts someone is when they can see the light that is within you, when they can feel the warmth of the fire that is within you. That's what converts people. And we need to be able to let that shine, and not just always be standing behind the shield of our intellectual answers, or our quoting this saint or that saint. Or we need to find a way to let people see the actual faith that we have and that we experience.
through our footsteps, through our actions.
Through our actions.
It's
through our
much more
footsteps.
so than what we say.
And I think much more than what we say when we're trying to explain and defend is what we say when we tell a story. How often tonight have we told stories from Father George's life? About this happened, that happened, he said this. And stories affect us in a way that argumentation does not.
Exactly. It is still one of the most powerful forms of knowledge transfer. Because
Yes.
in the beginning, there was no written language, right? The tradition is still the storytelling. There is even a Harvard knowledge management is the best in literature. That is, it starts with storytelling, the art of storytelling.
It
Very
does.
important, from godparents to pass the tradition on to the godchildren, and etc. And we don't take advantage of that because now most of the time we're in front of some type of square boxes.
Yes.
Just behind
It's certainly the Western way, and especially Western Christianity, is argue about ideas. With the Protestant Reformation and the Catholic Counter-Reformation, it got all about framing the ideas in the right way, the right combative way to devastate your opponent. Where is Christ in all of this? When I became Orthodox, I guess I thought it was just going to be another version of the Christianity I was familiar with. And I came to see there really is not the absolute reliance on intellectualism. Some people say Orthodox is anti-intellectual. Well, let's look at the ecumenical councils. What do you think of them? Obviously, this is not an intellectually incompetent church. The emphasis is not on argumentation. It's on the lives of the saints. How is the faith taught? We hear stories about this saint, that saint, what he said, what he did. Stories of miracles. And so I think that one way that we let the light shine is by telling the stories about Father George and about all the saints we've known, the other confessors who, as an American, I don't know very well yet. There are so many more confessors I need to learn about as I repent of thinking I was a Christian and there were no Christians in those lands at the time. But we all have our own stories as well. And so I think we need to learn how to tell my story about the time God spoke to me. The stories that you two ladies have in a long lifetime in Christ, of all the ways that God has encouraged you or shown you a little miracle. We all have stories, certainly the clergy more than anyone else. I think we should be thinking about humbly telling our stories, even if people laugh at us and they don't believe us. Nevertheless, the sheer quantity of true stories we can tell lights a fire. And I think that's the fire that Father George was talking about. As we look ahead to possible persecution for Christians in my land, I'm trying to remember his humility, and that though he had such a great intellect, that wasn't where he put his faith. And to think about the stories that God gives me and still is giving me, that maybe I'll be able to tell someday, so that maybe people can catch fire from the little tiny fire God has given me.
Just like the holy fire that came from so far away and just keeps propagating.
Yes.
In this country, America, which is on the verge of or in the midst of a spiritual crisis, we have stories to tell. We have righteous people who lived here and who taught the gospel. St. Innocent, St. Herman of Alaska, Patriarch Tikhon, St. Raphael of Brooklyn,
St. Olga,
Father Gheorghe Calciu, Archbishop John of Shanghai and San Francisco, Father Seraphim Rose, Brother Jose Munoz Cortez,
Father
Keeper of the Montreal First Streaming Icon, and others. We have others. We have monastics who are hidden away, not broadcasting their lives, but we have stories to tell too to our own people here. So it's not that we have to tell stories about people in Russia or Romania. They were here.
Yep, exactly.
And they achieved their salvation here. And, well, anyway, I hope that people who are watching us in Belgium enjoyed our session, and we'll have to do it again sometime.
Amin, can get the sparkle, right?
I do have one story. I'd like to tell.
Oh, yeah, please, Father.
Because I was thinking of this as Monica was speaking, Prayer-Tessa. Of course, I knew Father George through Prayer-Tessa, through Frederica. And it occurred to me once that having met Father George on several occasions, there were times when we went over together. When Frederica would make her confession, we would do something, go to a restaurant or something. So did have the opportunity to meet Father George. And I said to him, we're both pastors of Holy Cross congregations, Sfântul, something like that.
Yeah, it's Father George.
Yeah. So, yes, we should do that. You know, when our patronal feast comes around, September 14th, let's try to do something together. And so what we ended up doing was that we hosted his congregation for the feast. It was an evening liturgy for us. And Father came, brought some members of the congregation, and Father preached and served at the altar. And I remember, since we were a small church, about the size actually of Holy Cross in Arlington, I was sitting in the first row of the congregation, which is where I need to sit if I'm going to hear, as Father preached, and he preached so passionately about the cross. You could hear the word cross often. And I emphasize the fact that you could often hear it because there were a lot of things that I couldn't understand. Because, as Frederica has said, his accent was still so thick. But what I heard in the parish hall afterwards from members of my congregation was what a powerful speaker this was. You know, the Father George had communicated not just the cross, but the resurrection through his preaching of the cross. Now, I know that they could not have heard maybe 1 in 10 words, but I think that his passion, more importantly, his firm conviction about the presence of Christ, and the presence of Christ was really in him. I think it's remarkable. I think every one of you who just spoke said something about his countenance or his smile. You know, the expression was on his face. Nothing less than the resurrection.
Amen. Amen.
Absolutely.
He never asked you to become Orthodox. Never. But he had that peace. It was something that I said, I don't know what it is. I can't quite tell, but I want it.
Yeah, that's right.
And and so closing, thanking each one of you, and from coming to think, even at the time that I met Father, I never really realized in terms of impact. Going back to confession. Confessing to him was a very unique experience because you really did feel that you were at the presence in which you could completely open up without any reservation. He really put you at easy, and it was like really a personal. Sometimes he would actually, sit on the floor.
Sit on the floor next to
Exactly,
you.
just to put you at easy. And it was like a dialogue, but most importantly, during the confession, I do remember there was something that, based on my perspective, was something horrible, and I'm confessing to him, and he looks at me with the same smile. I'm like, Maria, you are just about one of the most innocent people I have ever met. and I'm like, Father, did you hear what I just say? And I was actually upset. I was upset with him. So did you actually hear that? Let me say, maybe you don't understand. Let me say slowly. Maybe it's just the language barrier here. And I said, no, you don't need to say it again. I know exactly what you mean. And I said, so you don't think that you are this innocent people that I see, that I'm telling you that you are? And he said, and I said, absolutely not, Father. Otherwise, I would not be here confessing to you. I want to make sure that you're understanding here, and I'm not misrepresenting myself. So he looks at me and said, well, if you don't think that you are that person that I know you are, and I see in you, become that person. So that to me is the most important message. Father, when he looked at someone, when he received someone, when he smiled at someone, he did not see the as-is state. He saw in each one of us, even in his enemies, he saw the image of God himself, the person that you were created to be like. And then with a very loving but firm, he was very loving, very kind, but don't let him fool you. He was very firm. When he had to call, he had no problems going to a parishioner's home and telling you go and you take care of your wife. It never crossed, and people would, I've seen him breaking people. I personally witnessed that. But anyhow, to make a long story short, he saw that potential, that person that you were created to be, according to the image of God himself. And then in a very loving and firm way, he challenged each one of us to become that person. And I will never forget that confession, because since that day, I strive to become that person that he saw in me. You know, it gets you one step closer and closer and closer to God, because I remember those words. I will never forget that. He saw beyond the decay, because those monsters, even when we see, what has happened and what is happening now with persecuted Christians all over the world again, we see that the numbers increasing, even, during Palm Sunday. What you see, we all have this type of, not potential, but the minute we lose our connection with God, we become those monsters. And it's a very fine line that we walk. So keeping that thread and really, striving to become that person that we were created to be, is to me one of the most impactful messages. And I only now, many years later, I sort of begin to understand. And Frederica, just like yourself, I am the earliest Orthodox in here. I had my 11th anniversary. Yeah, my 11th anniversary. And long story how we met, how he crossed my path. It has many similarities with Father Leonid's path as well. But sometimes when you are such a sinner, God has to sort of strike you with a lightning bolt or put a saint right in front of you. So one way or the other, he calls everybody. He gives all of us a chance. But sometimes we don't realize it. Once again, I thank each one of you. I hope we can get together again. Please, Father.
Eternal.
Memory eternal.
Yes.
Memory eternal.
Блаженному успение вечный покой. Подашь, Господи, Божьему рабу Твоему, преснопамятному иерею Георгию, и сотвори ему вечную Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the gypsy story wide. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the gypsy story wide. Christ is risen from the dead, trampling down death by death, and upon those in the gypsy story wide.
alive.
Christ is risen.
Truly
is risen.
Христос воскрес. Христос анести.
Hristos înviat. Adevărat înviat.
I'll say.